Thank you for joining us in another exciting adventure in miniature books. Today we are presenting my favorite miniature book printer of all times. This man caused an actual renaissance in the production of thousands of new miniature books in the latter half of the 20th century. His name was Achille St. Onge. My name is Rick Hill, and I am honored to be with you and to bring to you the complete summary of all of his wonderful books. So let's get started. So what was so special about Achille St. Onge? His father had been a barber in downtown Worcester, Massachusetts, and his mother a homemaker. But a combination of circumstances in 1930 and 1931, when Archie, as his friends called him, was 17 and 18 years old, would change the course of miniature books forever. From all accounts, the young Archie wanted to make an impact at North High School in Worcester. So he joined the school newspaper, the Worcesterian, and rose to the rank of editor his senior year. Circumstance number one. He sold ads for the paper, arranged for the printing, and had his friends write articles. One of those articles was about the librarian at the public library and his collection of miniature books. Circumstance number two. The librarian shared the article with a friend of his who just happened to publish the most important miniature book magazine of its time, the newsletter of the 64 Mo. Circumstance number three. Now, 64 Mo refers to the size of a book. In the U.S., they start with folio, the largest, and go all the way down to 64 Mo. 64 Mo is a printer's term which tells how many times the initial piece of paper was folded to become a page. So 64 Mo is very small. James D. Henderson was the editor of the newsletter of the 64 Mo, and he got a hold of a young Achille St. Onge, and he encouraged him to publish a miniature book. So, at the age of 22, in 1935, St. Onge published his first book, Noel. Noel was edited by the librarian, Robert Shaw, and it was printed at Staub's Printer in Worcester. Binding was by Weatherby and Company, limited to 278 books. Now, this is my opinion. The paper is way too heavy for that book. The printing and the registration is just off. Paper is not archival, and most likely it was whatever was available. I see this as a learning experience for St. Onge. Several years later, now at 26, a great deal had happened in St. Onge's life since Noel. He got married to Margaret. He had a 1-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, and a newborn, David. And he had met 79-year-old Daniel Berkeley Updike, founder of Marymount Press. The young St. Onge was working as a salesman for a printing company in Worcester with an annual salary of $1,500. The median income was $956 that same year, so Archie was doing pretty well. One can easily speculate that even with all of the added family, a little extra cash could renew St. Onge's interest in expanding his hobby of printing miniature books. Friendship was his next book. It was bound at Sangorsky and Sutcliffe, and as one of the employees remembers, it was bound during a blitz of German bombs over London. Now, since Archie was working for a printing company and as a salesman, the same manner of job that I had for over a decade, St. Onge would have had to become very familiar with different grades of paper, binding, typography, and book design. His meeting B.D. Updike, one of the finest representatives of the arts and crafts movement in American books arts, and the influence it had on the young St. Onge is obvious in Friendship. The book is light years ahead of the rudimentary Noel. The paper is not coarse and heavy. It's light and sturdy. And to quote the colophon, worthy hand and arrow paper by D.B. Updike himself. The next book, 5 American Immortals, St. Onge decided was a year later, 1940. Letterpress again by D.B. Updike, who would pass away a year later. St. Onge liked the gold foil die on the front and decided to use it again 3 years later on his 4th book, 1943, The Inaugural Address of Thomas Jefferson, again printed by Staub's Press and binding by Weatherby and Company, which had also done Noel. Now the difference between the 5 Immortals and the inaugural address is striking. The hot foil stamping machine could not get the die hot enough to adhere to the front cover. Comparing the two under a microscope, it's quite obvious that the hot foil die just did not adhere to the book on the Thomas Jefferson. Out of the 200 books printed, St. Onge had to destroy 170 of them. That left 30 books to be sold. Of those 30 books, we now know the whereabouts of only 20. And over the course of almost 80 years, one can conceive that 10 were easily lost, thrown away, or hiding for you to find. Of those 20 copies that we know of, 11 are in the possession of libraries or universities. The remaining 9 are in the possession of private collectors. And I'm proud to say that I am one of those 9. He didn't see his miniature books as mere oddities. He wanted them to have a utility with information that could easily be read and have an aesthetic value found only in the finer books printed by the world's exceptional printers, handmade paper makers, and binderies. But still, St. Onge was a miniature book hobbyist, much as Michelangelo picked up painting to get away from the stress of being a sculptor. However, he had a growing family and regular bills to pay, and even though he made a nice living, he had to ensure that his hobby didn't keep him from making his house payment. The answer was to pick subjects that would be of interest to the average reader, print in bulk as high as possible in order to keep the per-book price as low as possible. In printing, quantity, or the number of books printed, is one of the least of your worries. It is all the upfront cost of setting the type, the ink, and the printing press time, and creating the metal or paper dies necessary for the gold foil stamping on the covers. Those were a large part of the cost, of course. So in the 1940s and 50s printing cost, St. Onge could add more books to sell at around 15 to 35 cents per unit or copy. A natural subject which interests both Archie and his target audience was history. So he printed, starting in 1940, 5 American Immortals. The Inaugural Address of Thomas Jefferson. The Inaugural Addresses of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Lincoln, selections from his writings. Churchill, King George VI, the Prime Minister's broadcast. Daniel Webster on the powers of government assigned to it by the Constitution. And in 1953, Form and Order of the Service in the Coronation of Her Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II. The Inaugural Address of Dwight D. Eisenhower. Carl Sandburg, Abraham Lincoln. The Inaugural Address of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Now, After the assassination of Kennedy, St. Onge was encouraged to make more copies of the inaugural address of John F. Kennedy. How you can tell the difference between the two, that first and second and third editions, is that in the 1961 edition, the back cover is blank. In 1963, there is a crest that has his birth and death date. St. Onge delivered all of his books in a plastic box, and they were very carefully wrapped in plastic. So the one you're looking at actually has never been opened. So to continue the history, John Quincy Adams, The Wants of Man, 1962. Paul Revere's Ride. Sir Winston Churchill, Honorary Citizen of the United States of America. Thomas Jefferson on Science and Freedom. Magna Carta of King John. Inaugural Address of Lyndon Johnson. 1565 St. Augustine, Florida. Autobiography of Robert Goddard. Historic American Flags. Eulogy to U.S. Senator Robert F. Kennedy. Inaugural Address of Richard M. Nixon. Abraham Lincoln, A Song in His Heart. Mayflower Compact. Declaration of Independence. California on U.S. postage stamps. And in 1977, St. Onge's last book, The Addresses of Her Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II on occasion of her Silver Jubilee. Out of the 46 books which St. Onge published, 25 were on history. The second best-selling subject was literature and writing. Of course, Noel, 1935, Friendship. Thoreau, quotes from his writing. Lincoln, selections from his writings. From a Writer's Notebook. Formats and Foibles, a few books which might be called curious. Thoreau's Wild Apples. Sermon of His Eminence Francis Cardinal Spellman. Gray's Elegy written in a country churchyard. Archibald McLeish speech. Alas in Lilliput. Thoreau's Turtle Nest. Notes from Four Cities. Eugene O'Neill, Last Will and Testament of an Extremely Distinguished Dog. Shelley, Sermon on the Mount. Robert Frost, White Mountain. Essence of Aspen. And finally, a few on religion and other auspicious occasions. Silver Jubilee Sermon, Jewish Festivals, Thanksgiving Day Proclamation, Sermon on the Mount, and Francis Weber's, Mayor of Indianapolis, Father Joseph F. Weber. If you collect Achille St. Onge, then you most likely have a copy of the 3 macro miniatures that he produced. Tasha Tudor, noted lifelong New England resident and children's book artist, drew pictures for 2 of St. Onge's most popular books. St. Onge knew that he had a hit on his hand after he saw the drawings for the 23rd Psalm. A simple religious book would be of great interest to a very wide audience. He ordered 15,000 be printed by Jo Intzede in Holland. For those who collect variants, the 2 variants would be the dedication to her husband across from St. Onge copyright, and, of course, the 5 different colored leather book bindings. The second Tasha Tudor book was her illustrations for the classic Clement C. Moore poem, The Night Before Christmas. St. Onge ordered 2,000 copies from the same printer. His largest small book is one called is the one pictured, which he produced 500 copies of for the association by the same name. Even in his obituary in 1978, the Worcester Telegram and Gazette mentioned how far the 65-year-old St. Onge's miniature books went to touch the entire world. In 1945, this little book, The Inaugural Addresses of Franklin Roosevelt, was named one of the 50 best books of the year by the American Institute of Graphic Arts. Form and Order of the Service in the coronation of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II in 1953 warranted St. Onge to create a special cover made by Sigurdsky and Sutcliffe and presented to the new queen. In 1956, Wild Apple, one of the only 2 miniature books produced by perhaps the greatest book designer of the 20th century, Bruce Rogers. Rogers had previously declined St. Onge's request for him to design a miniature book by writing back to him, "I have come to the conclusion that I do not care to undertake it. There are too many difficulties." The Inaugural Address of John F. Kennedy. In 1961, St. Onge printed and sold 2,000 copies of the speech. When JFK was assassinated in 1963, the emotional response of the entire world was palpable. St. Onge knew that this book could sell many more copies. His first order was for 5,000 copies, and then a third printing of 3,000 copies. When Robert Kennedy, JFK's younger brother, scaled the newly named Mount Kennedy, he carried with him the St. Onge book and left it on the top of Mount Kennedy to honor his brother. Perhaps the greatest honor came in 1966, the autobiography of Robert Hutchings Goddard caught the attention of Buzz Aldrin, who took a copy of the book with him to the moon. St. Onge had asked him to leave a copy on the moon, but NASA regulations forbade leaving anything on the surface of the moon. So Aldrin had to lug the book all the way back to the Earth. He gave that copy to Goddard's widow, who later donated it to the Goddard Library at Clark University. Just as his little books made a huge impact, so did his short-lived publication, The Miniature Book Collector, edited by none other than Ruth Adamat. The little newsletter is a wealth of information and inspiration. You can feel the excitement of the writers as they see the beginning of a rebirth in an interest in miniature book production. It even had its own separate index compiled by another giant in the industry, Robert Massman. Even with such grandiose recognition, St. Onge still had to sell his little books. He advertised in the local newspapers, in national magazines, in his own miniature book collector, and in a special brochure. For the Kennedy inaugural book, he even convinced a local bank in Worcester to give one away with each new account opened. But as anyone involved in the printing industry knows, the key to success begins with your choice of printing house. For that, St. Onge went to the best printer in the world, Jo Enschede, in Haarlem, Holland. Since 1703, Isaac Enschede founded the print shop that would soon bear his son's name for the next 300 plus years, Jo Enschede. The business grew in profits and reputation throughout the centuries and saw a grand celebration for their 150th year. Today, Jo Enschede is the principal printer of euros and stamps. I wanted to see exactly how good of a printer they were or are, and I acquired one of their main products, a Nederlands 1 Gulden. I took my microscope and sought out the part of any job that drives printers insane, the tiniest lines and loops. The result, even on the closest area, is amazing. This is the finest printer in the world. Achille St. Onge was truly the master of all areas of his miniature books. and his legacy is seen in all of the publishers who came after him. If you are interested in learning more about Achille St. Onge or any information about miniature books, I would suggest you head over to the mbs.org, the website for the Miniature Books Society. The website has a section reserved for their newsletters over the years. I was honored to be the editor of the newsletter for several years. Each copy of the newsletter is packed with information about miniature books and their collectors. This was my last newsletter, and the Society has been told to take a different direction. And to have full disclosure, I am no longer a member of the Miniature Books Society. This little book was purchased by my mother in 1961, and it was given to me. I have kept it in its original plastic container ever since. I was never privileged to meet Archie in real life. However, I am friends with his second child, David. One person who knew him well was Robert Massman. Massman asked St. Onge to print his first miniature book, and Archie told him to print it himself. And that was exactly how another great line of miniature books began. Robert and Archie met at St. Onge's home in Worcester, and they soon realized that both of their wives had a great deal in common. Both were home economics teachers. Our best account of Archie comes from Massman. He characterized St. Onge this way: gracious, jolly, generous, and extremely busy with his hobby turned business. After St. Onge's death, it was Robert Massman who created the bibliography of Achille St. Onge. So now, let's look at two miniature book sellers who can help you acquire your own Achille St. Onge miniature book. Thanks for watching. The first bookseller is John Howell. If you'll go to John Howell for Books, it's F-O-R, not F-O-U-R, .com. He has a great website. I would suggest you subscribe for email offerings. Browse by category, and on page 4, you'll find miniature books. Extremely easy to order. Just click Add and follow the instructions. The other online seller is Sherry Bruning of Triangle Head Books of California. All of her books are on eBay. So start by going to ebaystores.com/trianglehead-books-of-California. Currently, Sherry has over 170 miniature books for sale on eBay. Both John and Sherry are very good friends, and I highly recommend them.
My friend, we are all interested in the future, for that is where you and I are going to spend the rest of our lives. And remember, my friend, future events such as these will affect you in the future.